Caleb's Redemption. Washington, D.C., 1920. Lillian Wright lit a candle in Major Nathaniel Blackwood's study, watching the flame flicker weakly. She turned away for just a moment. When she looked back, the candle had been snuffed out, and in the melted wax, someone had traced the initials NB. Chapter 1. The Uninvited Guest. The chill of the October evening seeped through the grand windows of the Georgetown townhouse, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. Lillian Wright shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It wasn't just the cold, a deeper unease had settled upon her, a prickling at the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the draft. Washington, D.C., in the autumn of 1920, still held its breath, 2 years after the armistice, as if unsure whether the peace would truly last. The air was thick with the ghosts of lost sons and shattered dreams. Lillian, at 58, had seen her share of both. Her own son, Thomas, had returned from the Argonne a changed man, his laughter replaced by a haunted silence. Her husband, Senator Edward Wright, buried himself in work, the war having aged him a decade in 4 short years. And then there was Major Nathaniel Blackwood, or rather, the persistent, unsettling absence of him. He had been due back from his extended assignment in Europe weeks ago. The official telegrams spoke of delicate negotiations, matters of national security, but Lillian knew better than to trust the sanitized pronouncements of the War Department. Nathaniel, a man she had known since he was a boy, a man who had become more in recent years, was not one for bureaucratic delays. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She stared at the flickering candle on his desk, the one she'd lit moments ago. It was a foolish habit, lighting a candle for him in his study, a silent prayer for his safe return. He'd teased her about it once, before he left, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. Sentimental, Lillian? You're losing your edge. But there had been a softness in his voice, a gratitude that belied his words. The flame sputtered and died. Lillian sighed, reaching for the matchbox again, when she noticed it. In the soft, quickly cooling wax, someone had clearly, deliberately traced 2 initials. NB. Her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. The house was locked, the servants dismissed for the evening. Edward was at a late-night session at the Capitol. She was utterly alone. Or so she had thought. A floorboard creaked behind her. Lillian whirled around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was empty, the shadows dancing in the firelight playing tricks on her eyes. But the faint, unmistakable scent of sandalwood and gunpowder that was real. It was Nathaniel's scent, a scent that had clung to his letters, to the worn leather of his gloves, to the memory of his presence. She moved to the window, peering out into the darkened street. Gaslights flickered, illuminating the empty cobblestones. A stray dog barked in the distance. Nothing. Then a movement. A flicker of shadow across the street, near the old oak tree where they had shared a stolen moment, a lifetime ago, it seemed. A figure, tall and lean, melted into the darkness before she could get a clear view. Lillian pressed her hand against the cold glass, her mind racing. Was it him? Had Nathaniel returned, secretly, without notifying anyone? And if so, why? The initials in the wax, the fleeting shadow, it all pointed to a clandestine arrival, a desperate attempt at communication. A new fear, colder and sharper than the first, gripped her. Nathaniel was a master of disguise, a skilled intelligence officer who had moved through enemy lines like a phantom during the war. If he was hiding, it meant he was in danger. Grave danger. She turned back to the desk, her gaze falling on the small, locked drawer where Nathaniel kept his most private papers. She knew the combination. He had entrusted it to her, months ago, just in case. Just in case of what, he hadn't said. But the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Just in case I don't come back. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the numbers. The lock clicked open. Inside, nestled among official-looking documents and coded messages, was a single, sealed envelope addressed to her, in Nathaniel's distinctive, bold handwriting. Lillian's hand shook as she reached for it. It was heavier than it looked. As her fingers brushed the paper, another scent, faint but distinct mixed in now, reached her. Roses. Her favorite. He remembered. Even in what must have been extreme danger, he remembered the small, useless detail of her fondness for roses. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to a love that had bloomed in the shadows, a love that was now threatened by forces she couldn't yet comprehend. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that opening this envelope would change everything. The uneasy piece of her life, the carefully constructed facade she maintained for the sake of her husband, her son, her position in society, all of it was about to shatter. Chapter 2. Whispers in the War Room. The envelope felt heavy in Lillian's hand, the thick paper rough against her trembling fingers. She hesitated, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This letter, she knew, held secrets that Nathaniel had risked his life to keep hidden. Secrets that could unravel everything. She sank into the worn leather chair behind Nathaniel's desk, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar room seem strange and menacing. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder, now mingled with the faint trace of roses, clung to the air, a ghostly reminder of the man who was both so near and yet so impossibly far. With a deep breath, Lillian tore open the envelope. Inside, there were two items, a folded letter and a small, tarnished silver key. The key was unfamiliar, cold and heavy in her palm. It looked old, the intricate carvings worn smooth with time. The letter was written on Nathaniel's usual stationery, the crisp paper bearing the embossed crest of his family. His handwriting, usually so bold and decisive, was hurried, almost frantic. My dearest Lillian, if you are reading this, it means I have either been compromised or worse. I cannot explain everything in detail, for fear this letter may fall into the wrong hands. But know this, I am in grave danger, and the danger extends to you, to Edward, to everyone connected to me. Lillian's heart pounded against her ribs. Compromised. The word echoed in her mind, conjuring images of betrayal, capture, and she couldn't bear to think of the worse. The key, the letter continued, opens a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Georgetown. Inside, you will find documents that will explain everything. You must retrieve them immediately, but be discreet. Trust no one, not even within the department. The department. The War Department, where Nathaniel had worked for years, where he had risen through the ranks to become one of the most trusted intelligence officers in the country. To think that there was someone or something within that very institution that he didn't trust, it was chilling. There is a conspiracy afoot, Lillian, one that reaches the highest levels of power. It involves a betrayal so profound, so devastating, that it could shake the very foundations of our nation. I have been gathering evidence for months, risking everything to expose it, but I fear I have run out of time. Lillian's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the letter. A conspiracy. Betrayal. The words swirled in her mind, a dizzying vortex of fear and disbelief. She had always known that Nathaniel's work was dangerous, that he dealt in secrets and shadows. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The documents in the safe deposit box contain the names of those involved, their motives, and their plans. You must get them to Senator Hawthorne. He is the only one I trust implicitly. He will know what to do. Senator Hawthorne. A close friend of Nathaniel's, a man of unwavering integrity and courage. He was also the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the one man who had the power to bring the conspirators to justice. I know this is a burden I should not place upon you, Lillian. But you are the only one I can trust. You have the strength, the intelligence, the unwavering loyalty that I have come to rely on. And, his handwriting softened here, almost imperceptibly, you have my heart. Always. Tears streamed down Lillian's face, blurring the words on the page. His heart. He had never spoken those words aloud, not even in their most intimate moments. Their love had been a silent, unspoken thing, a forbidden flame that had burned brightly in the darkness. A love born of shared grief, of mutual respect, of a connection that transcended the boundaries of duty and propriety. I do not know if I will see you again, my love. But know this. Every risk I have taken, Every danger I have faced has been for you, for the hope of a future where we could be together, free from the shadows. A future that may now be forever out of reach. The letter ended abruptly, without a signature. Just a single, hastily drawn rose, its petals slightly smudged, as if he had been interrupted. Lillian clutched the letter to her chest, her body racked with sobs. The weight of his words, the depth of his love, the enormity of the task he had entrusted to her, it was almost too much to bear. But she knew what she had to do. She had to be strong, for Nathaniel, for the future he had dreamed of, for the country he had served so faithfully. She had to retrieve those documents, expose the conspiracy, and bring the traitors to justice, even if it meant risking everything. She wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. She would not fail him. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She rose from the chair, the silver key clutched tightly in her hand. The fire in the hearth had died down, leaving the room in near darkness. But in her heart, a new flame had been ignited, a flame of determination, of courage, of a love that would not be extinguished. As she left that study and headed out into the night air, the image of the initials N.B. forever in her mind, she resolved. She quietly left her home, the only sound, her soft but determined footsteps. Chapter 3. A dance of shadows and secrets. The streets of Georgetown were shrouded in a thick fog, the gaslights casting an eerie, diffused glow. Lillian pulled her cloak tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones, mirroring the cold fear that had settled in her heart. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every footstep behind her a potential pursuer. Nathaniel's warning, "Trust no one," echoed in her mind. She hailed a passing cab, giving the driver the address of the First National Bank of Georgetown. The ride was short, but it felt like an eternity. Lillian sat stiffly, her gaze darting nervously from window to window, scanning the streets for any sign of surveillance. She clutched the small silver key in her pocket, its cold metal a constant reminder of the perilous task ahead. The bank was closed, of course, its imposing facade dark and silent. Lillian dismissed the cab a block away, preferring to approach on foot, her senses on high alert. She circled the building, checking for any signs of activity, any indication that she was being watched. The fog, her unexpected ally, offered a veil of concealment, but it also amplified the sounds of the night, the distant rumble of a streetcar, the muffled voices of late-night revelers, the rustle of unseen creatures in the nearby bushes. She found the after-hours entrance, a small, nondescript door tucked away on the side of the building. Her heart pounded in her chest as she inserted the silver key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, almost silent click. She slipped inside, closing the door quickly behind her. The interior of the bank was even darker than the street, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. She fumbled in her purse for a small electric torch, a gift from Nathaniel, another just-in-case precaution. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor lined with rows of safe deposit boxes. She found the box number that Nathaniel had indicated in his letter. It was located in a secluded corner, almost hidden from view. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key, her breath catching in her throat. The lock clicked open, and the heavy metal door swung inward. Inside, nestled among layers of protective tissue paper, was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Lillian lifted it out carefully, her fingers brushing against the worn leather. It felt heavy, weighty with the secrets it contained. She hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over her. This was it. The evidence Nathaniel had risked his life to gather. The truth that could shake the nation. As she opened the portfolio, the beam of her torch illuminated the first page. It was a handwritten list of names, each one followed by a brief, cryptic note. Lillian recognized some of the names immediately: prominent politicians, military officials, even members of the president's cabinet. Her blood ran cold. Suddenly, a noise behind her, a soft, scraping sound, like a shoe brushing against the stone floor. Lillian whirled around, her torch beam darting wildly. The corridor was empty. She held her breath, listening intently. Silence. Had she imagined it? Was it just the old building settling? Or was someone there, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike? Paranoia, she realized, was a dangerous weapon. It could cloud her judgment, make her see threats where none existed. But Nathaniel's warning was clear. Trust no one. She quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them into her purse. She closed the safe deposit box, locking it securely. She had to get out of there, get to Senator Hawthorne before it was too late. As she turned to leave, she saw a shadow, moving quickly across the far end of the corridor. It was too fast, too fleeting to be a trick of the light. Someone was definitely there. Lillian extinguished her torch, plunging herself into darkness. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding like a drum. She waited, listening, her senses straining to detect any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. Lillian? The voice was familiar, a deep, resonant voice that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice she had longed to hear for weeks, a voice that had haunted her dreams.
Nathaniel?
She whispered back, her voice trembling. The shadow moved again, stepping into the faint light filtering in from the street. And there he was, Major Nathaniel Blackwood.
Alive.
But different. He was thinner, his face drawn and haggard, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond mere exhaustion. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark overcoat that concealed his familiar military bearing. He looked like a fugitive, a man on the run. Lillian, he said again, his voice hoarse, you shouldn't be here. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost buckled her knees. He was alive. He was here. But the relief was quickly followed by a surge of anger. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her voice rising. Why all the secrecy? The letter, the key, the initials. He held up a hand, silencing her. There wasn't time. I had to make sure you were safe. They're watching me, Lillian. They know I have the evidence. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who are they? He hesitated, his gaze darting around the darkened corridor. I can't tell you here. It's not safe. We have to go. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers. His touch, usually so warm and reassuring, was cold and clammy. He was afraid. And that fear, more than anything else, convinced her that the danger was real. He pulled her close, whispering, we do not have much time. We must leave quickly, but do you have the documents, Lillian? She nodded, clutching her purse. Chapter 4. The Telegram from Nowhere. Nathaniel led Lillian through the labyrinthine corridors of the bank, moving with a practiced stealth that spoke of his years of experience in covert operations. They emerged into the foggy night, the air heavy with the threat of rain. He guided her quickly down a side street, away from the main thoroughfare, his hand firmly gripping hers. Where are we going? Lillian asked, struggling to keep pace with his long strides. Somewhere safe, he replied, his voice tight with urgency.
Somewhere we can talk.
He led her to a small, unassuming boarding house a few blocks from the bank. The building was dark and silent, the only sign of life a flickering gas lamp above the front door. Nathaniel produced a key, unlocking the door with a practiced hand. I've been using this place as a temporary base of operations, he explained, ushering her inside. It's not much, but it's off the grid. No one knows I'm here. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a rickety table, and two mismatched chairs. A single window looked out onto a darkened alleyway. The air was stale and musty, the silence broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from a leaky faucet. Nathaniel lit a small oil lamp, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He turned to Lillian, his face etched with concern. Are you all right? He asked, his voice softening. I know this is a lot to take in. Lillian nodded, trying to compose herself. She was still reeling from the shock of seeing him alive, from the fear that had gripped her in the bank, from the realization that the danger he had warned her about was very real. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. Why all the secrecy? Why couldn't you just come home? Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. "It's complicated, Lillian," he said. "The conspiracy I uncovered, it goes deeper than I ever imagined. It involves people I trusted, people I considered friends. People in positions of power who are willing to do anything to protect their secrets." He began to pace the room, his movements agitated. "I had to disappear. I had to make them think I was either dead or had fled the country. It was the only way to buy myself some time, to gather the final pieces of evidence I needed." "But the letter," Lillian said, "you said you were out of time." He admitted. "They were closing in. I had to get the evidence to Senator Hawthorne, but I couldn't risk contacting him directly. They're watching him too. They're watching everyone." "So you sent the letter to me," Lillian said, a realization dawning on her. "You used me as a courier." "I didn't have a choice," Nathaniel said, his voice pleading. "You were the only one I could trust. The only one who wouldn't be suspected." Lillian felt a surge of anger, mixed with a strange sense of pride. He had trusted her. He had entrusted her with his life, with the fate of the nation. "But why the initials in the wax?" she asked. "Why the shadow in the street?" Nathaniel stopped pacing and looked at her, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "I had to let you know I was back," he said. "I had to see you, even if it was just for a moment. I had to make sure you were safe." The anger drained away, replaced by a wave of tenderness. He had risked everything, just to see her, just to reassure her. "But now what?" she asked. "What do? We get the evidence to Hawthorne," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "We expose the conspirators, and we bring them to justice." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I received a telegram this morning," he said. "It's from Hawthorne. He's agreed to meet with us. But it has to be tonight. He's leaving for Europe tomorrow, and he won't be back for weeks." Lillian's heart leaped with hope. This was their chance. Their only chance. "Where?" she asked. "The old observatory," Nathaniel said. "Midnight. The old observatory. A deserted, crumbling structure on the outskirts of the city. A place where they had often met in secret before the war, before their lives had become so complicated. A place filled with memories, both bittersweet and forbidden." Just then, a loud banging on the door below. Nathaniel's eyes grew wide. "Hide the documents," he whispered urgently, his voice sharp. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Argonne. The pounding on the door reverberated through the small room, each knock a hammer blow against Lillian's already frayed nerves. Nathaniel's eyes, wide with a mixture of alarm and calculation, met hers. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, friend or foe. "Hide the documents," he repeated, his voice a low, urgent hiss. Lillian's mind raced. The portfolio was too large to conceal easily. Her purse, already bulging with the papers, offered little protection. Her gaze fell on the narrow bed, its threadbare blanket rumpled and uneven. With a swift movement, she slipped the portfolio beneath the mattress, smoothing the blanket over it as best she could. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do in the limited time. Nathaniel, meanwhile, had moved to the window, cautiously peering through a gap in the curtains. He held a small, discreet pistol in his hand, his knuckles white as he gripped the weapon. The pounding continued, more insistent now, accompanied by a muffled voice shouting something unintelligible. "Who is it?" Lillian whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the street below. "I can't see the fog," he muttered. But the voice, it sounds familiar. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. A moment of silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the frantic beating of Lillian's heart. Then, a new sound, the scraping of metal against metal, the unmistakable click of a lock being picked. Nathaniel swore under his breath. "They're coming in," he said, his voice grim. He turned to Lillian, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "Stay behind me, and whatever happens, don't say a word." He positioned himself between Lillian and the door, his body tense, his pistol raised. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He held a lantern in one hand, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows on the walls. For a moment, neither man moved. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Then the man in the doorway spoke. "Major Blackwood?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "Is that you?" Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the voice. It was Sergeant Miller, Nathaniel's former adjutant, a man who had served with him in the Argonne, a man who had saved his life more than once. Nathaniel lowered his pistol slightly, but his body remained tense. "Miller?" he said, his voice questioning. "What are you doing here?" Miller stepped into the room, the lantern light illuminating his face. He looked older, his face lined with fatigue, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that mirrored Nathaniel's. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a heavy overcoat concealing his muscular frame. "I've been looking for you, Major," Miller said, his voice flat. "We need to talk."
We?
Nathaniel asked, his eyes narrowing. "Who's we?" Miller hesitated, his gaze shifting to Lillian, who stood silently behind Nathaniel. "It's complicated," he said. "Let's just say there are some people who are very interested in your activities." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The confrontation she had been dreading. The moment of truth. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nathaniel said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Don't play coy with me, Major," he said. "We know about the documents. We know about the conspiracy. And we know you're planning to take it all to Hawthorne." Nathaniel's grip tightened on his pistol.
Who told you that?
He demanded. "It doesn't matter," Miller said. "What matters is that you're playing a dangerous game, Major. A game you can't win." "I'm not playing a game," Sergeant Nathaniel said, his voice hardening. "I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to expose a group of traitors who are betraying our country." Miller shook his head sadly. "You're a fool, Major," he said. "A naive fool. You think you can change things? You think you can fight the system? You're wrong. The system always wins." "Maybe," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering. "But I'm not going to stand by and watch while these criminals destroy everything we fought for." A flicker of something admiration? Regret? Crossed Miller's face. "You were always stubborn, Major," he said. "Always willing to fight for what you believed in, even when it was hopeless." He paused, his gaze shifting to Lillian again. "And you, Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this. You don't deserve this." Lillian met his gaze, her chin held high. "I'm not afraid, Sergeant," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I believe in what Nathaniel is doing, and I'm going to stand by him no matter what." Miller nodded slowly. "I admire your loyalty, Mrs. Wright," he said. "But loyalty can be a dangerous thing. It can blind you to the truth. It can lead you down a path from which there is no return." He turned back to Nathaniel, his expression hardening. "I'm here to offer you a deal, Major," he said. "Hand over the documents, and we'll let you walk away. You and Mrs. Wright will forget this ever happened." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "And what about the conspirators?" he asked. "What about the betrayal?" Miller shrugged. "That's not your concern," he said. "Your concern is your own safety, and the safety of Mrs. Wright." A tense silence filled the room. Lillian could feel the weight of Nathaniel's decision pressing down on her. It was a choice between justice and survival, between loyalty and betrayal. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, the shrill whistle of a police siren, growing closer. Miller's eyes widened in alarm. "Damn it," he muttered. "They're coming." He turned back to and advanced on Nathaniel. Chapter 6. The Major Scars. Miller's sudden advance broke the tense standoff. The sound of the approaching sirens, a clear indication that their precarious sanctuary had been compromised, spurred him into action. His hand darted inside his overcoat, a glint of metal flashing in the dim lamplight. Nathaniel reacted instantly, his years of training kicking in. He sidestepped Miller's lunge, his own pistol coming up in a swift, practiced motion. But Miller was faster than he expected, his movements honed by years of brutal combat in the trenches of France. He grabbed Nathaniel's wrist, twisting it violently, trying to disarm him. The two men grappled, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. The small room seemed to shrink around them, the sounds of their grunts and strained breathing filling the air. Lillian watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling utterly helpless. "Run, Lillian!" Nathaniel grunted, his face contorted in pain as Miller tightened his grip on his wrist. "Get out of here." But Lillian couldn't move. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear and indecision. She couldn't leave him, not like this. Not when he was fighting for his life, for their lives. Miller, his face flushed with exertion, managed to wrench the pistol from Nathaniel's grasp. The weapon clattered to the floor, skidding across the worn wooden planks. He then delivered a swift, brutal punch to Nathaniel's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Nathaniel stumbled, crashing against the rickety table. The oil lamp teetered precariously, then fell to the floor with a crash, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light now came from the lantern Miller held, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. Lillian screamed, a primal sound of terror and desperation. She finally found her voice, her courage, fueled by a surge of adrenaline.
"Stop it!"
she cried, rushing forward. "Leave him alone." Miller, momentarily distracted by Lillian's outburst, turned towards her, his eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this, Mrs. Wright," he growled. "This doesn't concern you." But Lillian wasn't listening. She grabbed a heavy wooden chair, the only weapon she could find, and swung it with all her might. The chair connected with Miller's shoulder, a sickening thud echoing in the small room. Miller staggered, momentarily stunned. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it gave Nathaniel the opening he needed. He lunged forward, tackling Miller around the waist, driving him back against the wall. The two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and grunts. They rolled across the room, grappling for dominance, the sounds of their struggle punctuated by the ever-closer wail of the police sirens. Lillian, her hands shaking, picked up Nathaniel's discarded pistol. She had never fired a gun before, her life a sheltered existence of privilege and social obligations. But now, facing the brutal reality of violence and betrayal, she knew she had to be prepared to use it. She aimed the pistol at Miller, her finger trembling on the trigger. "Get off him!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. Miller, his face contorted in rage, looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "You wouldn't shoot," he sneered. "You don't have the guts." Lillian's finger tightened on the trigger. She didn't know if she could do it, if she could actually pull the trigger and take a man's life. But she knew she had to protect Nathaniel at any cost. Suddenly, the door burst open, revealing two uniformed police officers, their guns drawn. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. "Police!" The sudden arrival of the police, a force that should have represented safety and order, brought a new wave of uncertainty. Were they truly there to help, or were they part of the conspiracy, sent to silence Nathaniel and retrieve the documents? Miller, seeing the officers, froze. He slowly raised his hands, his eyes darting between Lillian and the policeman. I can explain," he stammered. "This is all a misunderstanding." Nathaniel, bruised and bleeding, managed to push himself up into a sitting position. "He's lying," he said, his voice hoarse. "He's one of them. He's part of the conspiracy." The police officers looked from Nathaniel to Miller, their faces etched with confusion. They didn't know who to believe. The situation was chaotic, the truth obscured by layers of deception and lies. One of the officers turned to Lillian, his eyes questioning. "Ma'am," he said, "do you know these men?" Lillian hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. One wrong word, one misstep, could have disastrous consequences. She lowered the pistol, her hand still shaking. "This is Major Nathaniel Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's a war hero, and he's being framed." She then pointed at the fallen form of Miller. "He attacked us," she said to the police. "He tried to kill us." Chapter 7. A promise etched in glass. The arrival of the police officers, while seemingly a reprieve, had only plunged them into a deeper level of uncertainty. Lillian's declaration, branding Miller as the aggressor, hung in the air, a fragile shield against the intricate web of conspiracy that surrounded them. The officers, visibly perplexed, cautiously approached Miller, who was still on the floor, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He protested his innocence, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity, a personal dispute gone wrong. But his eyes, darting nervously between Nathaniel and the officers, betrayed his unease. "He has a gun," Lillian interjected, pointing to Miller's overcoat. "He tried to use it on us." One of the officers, a young man with a stern face, carefully patted down Miller, retrieving a small, concealed pistol from his coat pocket. Miller's face paled, his carefully constructed facade of innocence crumbling. "Major Blackwood," the older officer said, turning to Nathaniel, "can you corroborate Mrs. Wright's statement?" Nathaniel, still leaning against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, nodded slowly. "He's part of a conspiracy," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "He was trying to get his hands on some documents, evidence of treason." "Treason?" the younger officer exclaimed, his eyes widening. "What kind of treason?" Nathaniel hesitated, glancing at Lillian. He knew he couldn't reveal everything, not here, not in front of these officers, who might be part of the very conspiracy he was trying to expose. "I can't explain everything now," he said. "But I have proof. Evidence that implicates high-ranking officials in a plot to undermine the government." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was far beyond a simple assault or a personal dispute. This was something that could reach the highest levels of power, something that could shake the very foundations of their nation. "We need to take you both in for questioning," the older officer said, his voice grave. "And we need to secure these documents." Lillian's heart sank. Being taken into custody, even for questioning, was a dangerous proposition. It would put them at the mercy of the authorities, who might be compromised, who might be working for the very people they were trying to expose. "We have a meeting," Lillian said, her voice urgent, "with Senator Hawthorne. He's expecting us." The officers looked at her skeptically. "Senator Hawthorne?" the older officer said. "What does he have to do with this?" "He's the only one we can trust," Nathaniel said, his voice gaining strength. "He's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He needs to see the evidence." The mention of Senator Hawthorne, a man of unimpeachable reputation and considerable power, gave the officers pause. They were caught between their duty to uphold the law and the potential ramifications of interfering with a high-level investigation. "We can't just let you go," the younger officer said. "We have a protocol to follow." "But time is of the essence," Lillian pleaded. "Senator Hawthorne is leaving for Europe tomorrow. If we don't get to him tonight, the evidence might be lost forever." The older officer hesitated, his mind clearly wrestling with the dilemma. He looked at Nathaniel, his eyes searching. He saw the desperation in his face, the unwavering determination in his eyes. He saw the scars, both visible and hidden, of a man who had fought for his country, a man who had risked everything for what he believed in. "All right," the officer said, making a decision. "We'll escort you to Senator Hawthorne. But we're staying with you, every step of the way." Lillian and Nathaniel exchanged a look of relief, tinged with apprehension. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve. But the danger was far from over. They left the boarding house, the fog swirling around them like a shroud. The police officers, one in front and one behind, escorted them to a nearby police car. The streets were quiet, the city holding its breath, as if sensing the momentous events that were unfolding. As they drove towards the old observatory, Lillian reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of the portfolio hidden beneath the mattress of the bed back at the boarding house. She knew they had to retrieve it, somehow. It was the key to everything. She glanced at Nathaniel, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of the car. He was injured, exhausted, and facing an uncertain future. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a spark of hope, a flicker of the unwavering love that had sustained them through so much. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch, though weak, was reassuring. It was a silent promise, a vow etched not in ink, but in the shared experience of danger and love, a promise as fragile and as enduring as a reflection in a shattered mirror. He whispered, low enough so that only she could make out his words in the car. We will get through this. Together. The car sped on. The silhouette of the old observatory began to show against the night sky. Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. The old observatory loomed before them, a skeletal silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Its once proud dome, now riddled with holes and cracks, resembled a decaying skull, a fitting symbol of the secrets and betrayals that lay hidden within. The fog clung to its crumbling walls, giving it an ethereal, almost ghostly appearance. The police car pulled up to the entrance, its headlights cutting through the swirling mist. The two officers, their faces grim and watchful, escorted Lillian and Nathaniel out of the vehicle. The silence of the night was broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant howl of a dog. Stay close, the older officer warned, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. And no funny business. Nathaniel nodded, his expression stoic. He was still weak from his encounter with Miller, his body bruised and aching, but his resolve remained unshaken. He knew that this meeting with Senator Hawthorne was their last, best hope. They entered the observatory through a creaking, rusted door. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Cobwebs hung like macabre tapestries from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. The older officer lit a lantern, its flickering beam casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The light revealed the remnants of the observatory's former glory, a massive telescope, its lens cracked and clouded, pointed towards the heavens. Charts and diagrams, faded and torn, scattered across the floor, and a large, circular table, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Senator Hawthorne should be here any minute, Nathaniel said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. They waited, the silence stretching on, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant rumble of thunder. Lillian shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her. It wasn't just the cold, a sense of unease, of impending danger, had settled upon her. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. It was Senator Hawthorne, his tall, imposing frame silhouetted against the dim light. He was dressed in a heavy overcoat, his face etched with concern. Nathaniel, Hawthorne said, his voice a low rumble. What in God's name is going on? Nathaniel stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Senator, he said, we need your help. He quickly explained the situation, recounting the events of the past few hours, the letter, the key, the attack by Miller, the conspiracy that threatened to engulf them all. He spoke in a low, urgent voice, his words tumbling out in a rush. Hawthorne listened intently, his face growing graver with each passing moment. He asked pointed questions, probing for details, his sharp mind dissecting the complex web of deceit and betrayal. And the documents? Hawthorne asked, his gaze fixed on Nathaniel. Where is the evidence? Lillian stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. They're hidden, she said. In a safe place. But we need to retrieve them. Immediately. She explained about the portfolio hidden beneath the mattress in the boarding house, the risk of it falling into the wrong hands. Hawthorne nodded slowly, his mind already working on a plan. We need to get those documents, he said. But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust. He turned to the two police officers who had been standing silently, listening to the conversation. Officers, he said, his voice commanding, I need your assistance. I need you to secure those documents. And I need you to do it discreetly, without alerting anyone. The officers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. They were caught between their duty to follow orders and the potential ramifications of getting involved in a high-stakes political conspiracy. This is a matter of national security, Hawthorne said, his voice hardening. The fate of our country may depend on it. His words, spoken with the full weight of his authority, seemed to break through their hesitation. The older officer nodded slowly. We'll do what we can, Senator, he said. But we can't guarantee anything. I understand, Hawthorne said. Just do your best. The officers left the observatory, their footsteps fading into the night. Hawthorne turned back to Nathaniel and Lillian, his expression grave. We have to assume that we're being watched, he said. That our every move is being monitored. We need to be extremely cautious. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the dilapidated observatory. This place, he said, his voice trailing off. It's not safe. We need to find somewhere else to go. Somewhere secure. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from the entrance of the observatory. Everyone froze, their senses on high alert. The sound was followed by a muffled shout, then silence. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. What was that? He whispered. Nathaniel moved towards the entrance, his hand reaching for the pistol he had retrieved from the police car.
I don't know, he said.
But I don't like it. He cautiously peered through the doorway, his body tense, ready for anything. Lillian and Hawthorne waited, their hearts pounding in their chests, the silence stretching on, thick with anticipation. Then, Nathaniel's body went rigid. He staggered backward, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It can't be. He collapsed to the floor, a small, crimson stain spreading across his shirt. Standing in the doorway, a silhouetted figure holding a smoking gun, was a familiar face, a face that Lillian had trusted, a face that now represented the ultimate betrayal. It was Edward, her husband. Chapter 9. Beneath the veil of duty. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lillian stared, transfixed, at the scene before her. Nathaniel crumpled on the floor, the crimson stain blossoming on his chest, and Edward, her husband, the man she had shared her life with for over 30 years, standing in the doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a stark reminder of the violence that had just shattered the fragile hope they had clung to. Edward, Lillian whispered, her voice a choked gasp, unable to comprehend the reality of what she was seeing. Edward's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: shock, regret, and a chilling determination. He looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and pity. Lillian, he said, his voice hoarse, I had no choice. Senator Hawthorne, his face a mask of outrage, stepped forward. You shot him? He exclaimed, his voice trembling with disbelief. You shot Nathaniel? Edward nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Nathaniel's still form. He was going to expose us, he said, his voice flat. He was going to destroy everything. Expose you? Lillian cried, her voice rising in hysteria.
What are you talking about?
What have you done? Edward turned to her, his eyes pleading. Lillian, please, he said. Try to understand. I did it for us. For our family. For our country. For our country? Lillian scoffed, tears streaming down her face. You shot an innocent man, a war hero, in cold blood. How can you possibly justify that? Edward sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked tired, defeated, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. It's complicated, he said. There are things you don't understand, Lillian. Things I couldn't tell you. What things? Lillian demanded, her voice shaking with rage and grief. What secrets could possibly be worth this? Worth Nathaniel's life? Edward hesitated, his gaze shifting to Senator Hawthorne, who stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and disgust. It's about the war, Edward said, his voice low. About the decisions that were made. The sacrifices that were demanded. He began to pace the room, his movements agitated. We were involved in something, Lillian. Something unsavory. Something that had to be kept secret at all costs. What? Lillian pressed, her voice desperate. Tell me. What did you do? Edward stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. We were supplying arms to both sides, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Profiteering from the war. Making a fortune while millions of young men died in the trenches. Lillian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The revelation was like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her husband, a respected senator, a man of supposed integrity and honor, was involved in something so monstrous. And Nathaniel, Lillian said, her voice trembling. He found out? Edward nodded slowly.
He stumbled upon it, he said.
He started digging, asking questions. He was getting too close. He had to be stopped. So you killed him? Lillian cried, her voice breaking. You killed the man I loved? The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, the unspoken truth finally laid bare. Lillian had never admitted her feelings for Nathaniel, not even to herself, not fully. But now, in the face of his death, in the face of her husband's betrayal, the truth could no longer be denied. Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else. Something that looked almost like jealousy. I know about you and Nathaniel, he said, his voice low. I've known for a long time. Lillian stared at him, speechless. He had known. All this time, he had known about her forbidden love, her silent longing for another man. And he had said nothing. He had done nothing. Until now. I tried to ignore it. Edward continued, his voice trembling. I tried to pretend it wasn't happening. I told myself it was just a fleeting infatuation, that it would pass. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. But it didn't, did it? He said, his voice barely a whisper. You never stopped loving him. He lifted his head and locked eyes with Lillian. And that is what I can never forgive. Chapter 10. The Unsent Letter. Edward's confession, delivered with a chilling blend of regret and resentment, hung in the air, heavier than the scent of gunpowder. Lillian stared at him, her mind reeling, struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the cold-blooded murderer standing before her. His admission of knowledge about her feelings for Nathaniel, coupled with his twisted justification for the shooting, painted a portrait of a man consumed by jealousy and a desperate need to control. Senator Hawthorne, his face a mask of disgust, finally broke his silence. Edward, he said, his voice low and trembling, you're a disgrace. A disgrace to your office, to your country, to everything you claim to stand for. Edward flinched, but his expression remained hardened. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice defensive. I protected our interests. I protected our way of life. By killing an innocent man? Hawthorne retorted, his voice rising in anger. By betraying your own wife. By burying the truth beneath a mountain of lies? Edward didn't answer. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on Lillian, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. But Lillian couldn't offer him either. She was numb, her heart shattered into a million pieces. Where are the documents, Edward? Hawthorne demanded, his voice sharp. The evidence Nathaniel was trying to get to me. Where is it? Edward hesitated, his gaze shifting to the spot where Nathaniel had fallen. I don't know, he said. He must have hidden them. Hawthorne scoffed. Don't play coy with me, Edward, he said. You know exactly where they are. And you're going to tell me. Now. Edward shook his head. I can't, he said. It's too dangerous. They'll kill me. Who will kill you? Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. The other conspirators? Your partners in crime? Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. They're everywhere, Lillian, he said. They have eyes and ears everywhere. They control everything. Then we have to fight them, Lillian said, her voice gaining strength. We have to expose them. We have to bring them to justice. She moved towards Nathaniel's lifeless body, her heart aching with a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. She knelt beside him, gently touching his face, his cold, still face. I won't let his death be in vain, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I won't let them win. As she caressed Nathaniel's cheek, her fingers brushed against something tucked inside his jacket pocket. It was a small, folded piece of paper. She carefully pulled it out, her hands trembling. It was a letter, addressed to her, in Nathaniel's handwriting. Lillian's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. This was it, the final message from the man she loved, the key to unraveling the conspiracy that had claimed his life. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the hurried scrawl. My dearest Lillian, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means I have not been able to get the evidence to Senator Hawthorne myself. It means I am gone. Tears streamed down Lillian's face as she read his words, each one a dagger to her heart. I know this is not the way I wanted things to end. I had hoped I had dreamed of a future with you. A future free from the shadows, free from the lies. But that future is no longer possible. The documents, Lillian, are hidden in a place where only you can find them. Remember the old observatory? Remember the night we spent there, under the stars, before the war changed everything? Remember the promise we made, etched in the glass of the dome? Lillian's mind raced back to that night, years ago, when she and Nathaniel had shared a stolen moment of intimacy, a moment of forbidden love, under the vast expanse of the night sky. They had etched their initials, intertwined, into the glass of the observatory dome, a secret vow, a testament to their enduring affection. The documents are there, Lillian, hidden within the frame of the dome, near our initials. You will need a sharp object to pry them loose. Be careful, and trust no one. I love you, Lillian, always and forever. Nathaniel. The letter ended abruptly, without a signature, just a single, hastily drawn rose, its petals slightly smudged, a poignant reminder of his love, of his sacrifice. Lillian clutched the letter to her chest, her body racked with sobs. He had known. He had anticipated his own death, and he had made sure that the evidence, the truth, would survive. She looked up at Edward, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and fury. You killed him, she said, her voice trembling. But you didn't win. You won't win. She turned to Senator Hawthorne, her resolve hardening. We have to go back to the observatory, she said. We have to get the documents. She turned and noticed a glint from the floor, where Edward dropped his gun. Chapter 11. Trapped between two worlds. Lillian's gaze, locked onto the glint of the discarded pistol, reflected a sudden shift within her. The grief, though still raw and overwhelming, was now tempered by a steely resolve, a burning need for justice. She moved towards the gun, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving Edward's. Hawthorne, sensing the shift in Lillian, stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Lillian, he said, his voice cautious. What are you doing? Lillian ignored him. She reached down and picked up the pistol, its cold metal a stark contrast to the trembling heat of her hand. She had never held a gun before, let alone fired one, but the weight of it in her palm felt strangely empowering, a tangible representation of the fight that lay ahead. She turned to Edward, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and despair. You took everything from me, she said, her voice low and steady. You took my happiness, my future, the man I loved. And you did it all for what?
For money?
For power? Edward flinched, his eyes widening in alarm. He had never seen this side of Lillian, this fierce, unyielding determination. He had always underestimated her, dismissed her as a naive, sheltered society wife. He had never realized the strength that lay hidden beneath her gentle exterior. Lillian, please, he pleaded, his voice trembling. Put the gun down. We can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, Lillian said, her voice cold. You made your choice. And now you're going to pay the price. Hawthorne stepped between them, his hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. Lillian, he said, his voice firm but gentle, I understand your anger, your grief. But this isn't the way. We need to get those documents to the authorities. We need to expose the conspiracy legally, through the proper channels. Lillian hesitated, her gaze flickering between Edward and Hawthorne. She knew Hawthorne was right. Violence wasn't the answer. It wouldn't bring Nathaniel back. It wouldn't erase the pain, the betrayal. But the thought of Edward walking free, of him escaping justice, was unbearable. The image of Nathaniel's lifeless body, the crimson stains spreading across his shirt, flashed before her eyes, fueling her rage. He's a murderer, Lillian said, her voice trembling. He deserves to be punished. He will be punished, Hawthorne said, his voice reassuring. But we need to do this the right way. We need to follow the law. He reached out and gently took the pistol from Lillian's hand.
She didn't resist.
The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion. Hawthorne turned to Edward, his expression grim. "Edward," he said, "you're coming with me. You're going to tell me everything. You're going to name names. You're going to help us dismantle this conspiracy from the top down." Edward didn't answer. He just stood there, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, his spirit broken. He looked like a defeated man, a man who had lost everything. "We need to go back to the observatory," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to get the documents." Hawthorne nodded. "Yes," he said. "But first, we need to call the authorities. We need to secure the scene, and we need to get Edward into custody." He pulled out a small, portable telephone from his coat pocket, a relatively new invention, still a rarity in most households, and began to dial. Lillian watched him, her mind numb, her body aching. She felt trapped between two worlds, the world of privilege and social graces that she had always known, and the dark, brutal world of espionage and betrayal that had been revealed to her. She was no longer the innocent, naive woman she had been just a few hours ago. She had been changed, irrevocably, by the events of this night. As Hawthorne spoke to the authorities, arranging for police and medical personnel to be dispatched to the observatory, Lillian's gaze drifted back to Nathaniel's body. He lay there, still and silent, a tragic victim of a conspiracy that had reached into the highest echelons of power. She knelt beside him, gently touching his hand, his cold, lifeless hand. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the love that had been stolen from her, a love that would forever remain unfulfilled. The sound of approaching sirens, growing louder, signaled the arrival of the authorities. Lillian knew that the next few hours, the next few days, would be a whirlwind of activity, interrogations, investigations, revelations. The truth would come out, eventually, but it wouldn't bring Nathaniel back. It wouldn't erase the pain, the loss. It would not ever quell what had been done. She stood slowly, rising from the floor, the reality she must now accept, a reality without the man she loved, sinking into her soul. Chapter 12. The Serpent's Kiss. The arrival of the authorities brought a flurry of activity, shattering the somber silence that had fallen over the observatory. Police officers swarmed the scene, securing the perimeter, questioning witnesses, and gathering evidence. Medical personnel rushed to Nathaniel's side, confirming what Lillian already knew: he was dead. Edward was taken into custody, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He offered no resistance, his spirit seemingly broken by the weight of his actions. As he was led away, his gaze met Lillian's, a silent plea for forgiveness, for understanding, hanging in the air. But Lillian couldn't offer him either. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. Senator Hawthorne, his face grim and determined, took charge of the situation, using his influence and authority to ensure that the investigation was handled properly, that the truth would be revealed, no matter how high the stakes. He spoke to the lead investigator, a seasoned detective named Inspector Davies, emphasizing the importance of discretion and the need to protect the integrity of the evidence. "This is more than just a murder, Inspector," Hawthorne said, his voice low and urgent. "This is a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. We need to be extremely careful." Davies nodded, his expression serious. "We'll do our best, Senator," he said. "But we need your cooperation. We need you to tell us everything you know." Hawthorne agreed, promising to provide a full account of the events leading up to Nathaniel's death, including Edward's confession and the existence of the hidden documents. Lillian, meanwhile, stood apart, watching the scene unfold with a detached numbness. She felt like an observer, a spectator in her own life, the events of the past few hours playing out like a surreal, nightmarish drama. She was physically present, but her mind, her spirit, were elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of grief and disbelief. As the police began to process the crime scene, Lillian's gaze drifted to the shattered dome of the observatory, its jagged edges silhouetted against the lightning sky. She remembered Nathaniel's letter, his final message, revealing the location of the hidden documents. "Hidden within the frame of the dome, near our initials." She had to get to those documents. She had to retrieve them before anyone else did, before they could be destroyed or manipulated. It was her duty, her responsibility, to honor Nathaniel's final wish, to ensure that his sacrifice was not in vain. She approached Inspector Davies, her voice hesitant but firm. "Inspector," she said, "I need to go up to the dome. There's something I need to retrieve." Davies looked at her skeptically. "The dome is unstable, ma'am," he said. "It's not safe." "I know," Lillian said. "But it's important. It's evidence, related to the case." Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting to Hawthorne, who nodded in agreement. "Let her go, Inspector," Hawthorne said. "But send an officer with her. For her safety." Davies reluctantly agreed, assigning a young, uniformed officer to accompany Lillian. Together, they climbed the narrow, winding staircase that led to the observatory dome, the air growing colder and thinner with each step. The dome was even more dilapidated up close, its glass panels shattered and broken, its metal frame rusted and corroded. The wind whistled through the gaps, creating an eerie, mournful sound. Lillian scanned the frame, her eyes searching for the familiar initials, the intertwined N and L, etched into the glass years ago, a symbol of their forbidden love. She found them, almost hidden beneath a layer of grime and dust, a faint, ghostly reminder of a happier past. Using a small, sharp piece of broken glass, she carefully began to pry at the frame, just as Nathaniel had instructed. The metal was brittle, crumbling easily beneath her touch. After a few minutes of painstaking work, she managed to loosen a small section of the frame, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled among layers of protective cloth, was a small, leather-bound package. Lillian's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and anticipation. This was it, the evidence Nathaniel had risked his life to protect. As she reached for the package, a sudden noise behind her made her jump. She whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway, a silhouetted figure against the faint light of dawn, was a woman. A woman Lillian recognized, a woman she had considered a friend. It was Clarissa Davenport, Edward's secretary, a woman who had been a constant presence in their lives, a woman who had always seemed so loyal, so trustworthy. Clarissa's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else. Something that looked almost like triumph. "Lillian," Clarissa said, her voice trembling, "what are you doing?" Lillian didn't answer. She just stared at Clarissa, her mind racing, trying to make sense of this new, unexpected development. Clarissa took a step forward, her hand reaching inside her purse. "I know about the documents," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Edward told me everything." Lillian's grip tightened on the package. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Clarissa wasn't there to help. She was there to stop her. "They belong to me now, Lillian," Clarissa said, drawing a small derringer from her purse and aiming the gun at Lillian, a cruel twist marring her face. Chapter 13. A glimmer of hope in the ruins. Lillian stared at the small, deadly pistol in Clarissa's hand, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. The ruins of the observatory, once a sanctuary of shared dreams and whispered promises with Nathaniel, had become a stage for another act of betrayal. This time, the threat came not from a shadowy conspiracy, but from a familiar face, a woman she had welcomed into her home, a woman she had trusted. "Clarissa," Lillian said, her voice trembling but firm, "put the gun down. This isn't you." Clarissa's lips curled into a cruel smile, a stark contrast to the demure, subservient demeanor she had always presented. "Oh, but it is me, Lillian," she said. "It's always been me. You just never saw it." The young officer accompanying Lillian, who had been standing silently by, finally reacted. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for his own weapon. "Ma'am," he said to Clarissa, "drop the gun."
"Now."
Clarissa's eyes flickered towards the officer, a flicker of fear crossing her face. But she quickly regained her composure, her grip tightening on the derringer. "Stay back," she warned. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when a civilian is threatened with a firearm," the officer retorted, his voice steady. "Drop the gun, or I will be forced to shoot." Clarissa hesitated, her gaze darting between Lillian and the officer.
She was clearly outmatched, outgunned.
But her desperation, her determination to get her hands on the documents, seemed to override her sense of self-preservation. "I can't let you have them, Lillian," Clarissa said, her voice shaking. "They're too important. They're my ticket out of this life. Out of Edward's shadow." Lillian's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Clarissa?" she asked. "What do those documents have to do with you?" Clarissa laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the ruined dome. "Everything," she said. "They have everything to do with me. I'm not just Edward's secretary, Lillian. I'm his partner. In every sense of the word." Lillian gasped, her mind reeling. Edward and Clarissa? It was unthinkable, unbelievable, and yet it made a sickening kind of sense. The long hours Clarissa had spent at the office, the hushed conversations, the knowing glances, it had all been there, right in front of her, and she had been too blind, too trusting, to see it. "We've been planning this for years, Lillian," Clarissa continued, her voice gaining confidence. "The war profiteering, the conspiracy, it was all our idea. Edward was just the figurehead, the respectable face we needed to pull it off. And Nathaniel," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "He found out?" Clarissa nodded. "He was getting too close," she said. "He was a threat. He had to be eliminated." "So you told Edward to kill him?" Lillian asked, her voice trembling with rage and grief. Clarissa smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent shivers down Lillian's spine. "Let's just say I encouraged him," she said. "I reminded him of what was at stake, of what we stood to lose." Lillian felt a surge of fury, a burning need for revenge. But she knew she had to be careful. She had to play for time, to find a way to disarm Clarissa, to get the documents to safety. "And what about me, Clarissa?" Lillian asked, her voice steady. "What was your plan for me?" Clarissa's smile widened. "You, my dear Lillian," she said, "were always a loose end, a liability. Edward was too fond of you. He couldn't bring himself to eliminate you. But I can." She raised the derringer, her finger tightening on the trigger. Lillian knew this was it. Her life, her fate, hung in the balance. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below, followed by shouts and the sound of running footsteps. The police, alerted by the commotion, were on their way. Clarissa's eyes widened in alarm. She hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the entrance of the dome. She knew she was running out of time. "Give me the documents, Lillian," she demanded, her voice desperate. "And I'll let you live." Lillian knew it was a lie. Clarissa would never let her live. She was a witness, a threat. She had to be silenced. "No," Lillian said, her voice firm. "I won't let you have them. I won't let you win." She took a step forward, her eyes locked on Clarissa's. She had nothing to lose. Nathaniel was gone. Her life, as she knew it, was over. All that mattered now was protecting the truth, honoring his memory. Clarissa, panicked by the approaching police and Lillian's defiance, fired the derringer. A deafening roar as it went off. Chapter 14. The Stolen Photograph. The deafening roar of the derringer echoed through the observatory dome, the sound amplified by the shattered glass and crumbling walls. Lillian flinched, expecting to feel the searing pain of a bullet, but nothing happened. She was still standing, unharmed. She looked down, confused, and saw that the bullet had grazed her arm, tearing a small hole in her coat sleeve, but leaving her flesh untouched. It was a near miss, a stroke of luck that had saved her life. The young officer, reacting instantly, fired his own weapon, the shot ringing out in the confined space. Clarissa screamed, clutching her arm, the derringer falling from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She stumbled backward, her face contorted in pain and shock. The officer rushed forward, disarming Clarissa and pinning her against the wall. He was quickly joined by other officers who had raced up the stairs, alerted by the gunfire. Clarissa was subdued, handcuffed, and led away, her face a mask of defeat and despair. Lillian stood there, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come so close to death, to losing everything, but she had survived. And she still had the documents. She picked up the leather-bound package, her fingers brushing against the smooth, worn leather. It felt heavy, weighty with the secrets it contained, the secrets that had cost Nathaniel his life. She turned to the young officer, who was now checking her arm for injuries. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You saved my life." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "It's my job, ma'am," he said. "But you were very lucky." Lillian knew he was right. She had been incredibly lucky. But luck wasn't enough. She needed to be smart, resourceful, and determined if she was going to expose the conspiracy and bring the perpetrators to justice. Senator Hawthorne arrived at the dome, his face etched with concern. He had heard the gunshots and feared the worst. When he saw Lillian, alive and relatively unharmed, he rushed to her side, his relief palpable. "Lillian," he said, his voice trembling, "are you all right?" Lillian nodded, showing him the package. "I have the documents," she said. "They're safe." Hawthorne's eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and triumph. "Thank God," he said. "This is it. This is what we needed." He took the package from her, carefully examining it. "We need to get this to a secure location," he said. "We need to analyze the contents, identify the individuals involved, and build a case." He turned to Inspector Davies, who had also arrived at the dome, his face grim and determined. "Inspector," he said, "I want you to assign a team of your most trusted officers to this case. This is a matter of national security. We need to move quickly and discreetly." Davies nodded, his expression serious. "We'll do everything we can, Senator," he said. "We won't let you down." As the police secured the scene and began their investigation, Lillian felt a profound sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. The events of the past few hours had taken a heavy toll, leaving her drained and depleted. She walked over to the spot where Nathaniel had fallen, the place where he had drawn his last breath. She knelt down, gently touching the floor, as if trying to connect with his spirit, to feel his presence one last time. As she knelt there, her gaze fell upon a small, glinting object lying on the floor, partially hidden beneath a piece of broken glass. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against its smooth, cool surface. It was a photograph, a small, silver-framed photograph of her and Nathaniel, taken years ago, during that fateful night at the observatory. They were standing beneath the stars, their arms around each other, their faces radiant with happiness and love. It was a photograph she had cherished, a secret reminder of their forbidden romance. She had thought the photograph was lost, destroyed along with so many other mementos of their past. But here it was, salvaged from the ruins, a testament to the enduring power of their love. A single tear traced a path down Lillian's cheek as she clutched the photograph to her chest. It was a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost, but also a source of strength, a symbol of hope. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The conspiracy was vast and powerful, its tentacles reaching into every corner of society. But she was not alone. She had Senator Hawthorne, Inspector Davies, and a team of dedicated officers on her side. And she had the memory of Nathaniel, his love, his courage, to guide her. She rose from the floor, her resolve hardening. She would not rest until the truth was revealed, until justice was served. She would fight for Nathaniel, for his legacy, for the future he had dreamed of. As the dawn broke over the ruined observatory, Lillian knew one thing. She would never forget. Chapter 15. The Weight of Betrayal. The days following the chaotic events at the observatory blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Lillian found herself caught in a maelstrom of police interrogations, legal proceedings, and media scrutiny. The story of Nathaniel's murder, Edward's arrest, and Clarissa's attempted assassination had exploded across the headlines, captivating the nation and sending shockwaves through the corridors of power. Lillian, thrust into the unwelcome spotlight, navigated this treacherous landscape with a quiet dignity and unwavering determination. She cooperated fully with the authorities, providing detailed accounts of her experiences, sharing Nathaniel's letter, and handing over the crucial documents retrieved from the observatory dome. The documents, as Nathaniel had promised, contained a wealth of incriminating evidence, detailing the intricate web of war profiteering, arms dealing, and political corruption that Edward, Clarissa, and their co-conspirators had orchestrated. Names, dates, transactions, and secret communications were meticulously documented, providing a roadmap to the heart of the conspiracy. Senator Hawthorne, working closely with Inspector Davies and a hand-picked team of investigators, meticulously analyzed the evidence, piecing together the puzzle of deceit and betrayal. The scale of the operation was staggering, involving high-ranking officials in the government, the military, and the business world. It was a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of democracy, a betrayal of the public trust on an unprecedented scale. Lillian, meanwhile, grappled with the emotional fallout of the revelations. The knowledge that her husband, the man she had shared her life with for over 3 decades, was a cold-blooded murderer and a traitor, was a devastating blow. The carefully constructed facade of her marriage, her family, her life, had crumbled around her, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and disillusionment. She visited Edward in prison, seeking answers, closure, some semblance of understanding. But the encounter was fraught with tension and unspoken accusations. Edward, his face haggard and drawn, maintained his stance of justification, claiming he had acted for the greater good, for the protection of their family and their way of life. "I did it for us, Lillian," he insisted, his voice pleading. "I did it to secure our future." Lillian looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You did it for yourself, Edward," she said, her voice cold. "For your greed, your ambition, your insatiable hunger for power." Edward flinched, but he didn't deny it. He just sat there, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, a broken man, stripped of his power, his prestige, his illusions. Lillian left the prison, her heart heavy with sorrow and a profound sense of loss. She realized that she had never truly known her husband, that the man she had loved and trusted was a carefully constructed fiction, a mask that had concealed a dark and sinister truth. As the investigation progressed, more and more details of the conspiracy came to light. The names of the individuals involved were revealed, one by one, each revelation sending shockwaves through Washington society. There were arrests, indictments, and resignations, as the powerful figures who had once seemed untouchable were brought down by the weight of their own crimes. Lillian found herself ostracized by many of her former friends and acquaintances who viewed her as a pariah, a traitor to her class, a woman who had dared to expose the dark underbelly of their privileged world. She was subjected to whispers, stares, and outright hostility, as the social circles she had once navigated with ease closed their doors to her. But Lillian didn't care. She had found a new purpose, a new sense of direction. She was determined to see justice served, to honor Nathaniel's memory, to ensure that the sacrifices he had made were not in vain. She worked closely with Senator Hawthorne and Inspector Davies, providing invaluable insights and assistance in their investigation. She became a symbol of courage and resilience, a woman who had faced unimaginable betrayal and loss, yet refused to be silenced, refused to be broken. As the trial of Edward, Clarissa, and their co-conspirators approached, Lillian prepared herself for the ordeal of testifying, of reliving the horrific events of that fateful night at the observatory. She knew it would be painful, emotionally draining, but she was determined to speak the truth, to expose the lies, to ensure that justice prevailed. She found solace in the memory of Nathaniel, in the love they had shared, in the unwavering belief in justice that had driven him to his final, courageous act. She would carry his memory with her, a guiding light in the darkness, a source of strength in the face of adversity. She would not let them erase him. She would find the strength within her to finish what he started. Chapter 16. Beyond the Call of Duty. The trial of Edward Wright, Clarissa Davenport, and their numerous co-conspirators dominated the headlines, becoming a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed each day with journalists, spectators, and the curious, all eager to witness the unfolding drama of a high-society scandal that had rocked the nation to its core. Lillian, as a key witness, found herself at the center of the storm. She faced intense scrutiny from the press, the defense attorneys, and the public, her every word, her every gesture, dissected, and analyzed. The weight of responsibility, the burden of truth, pressed down on her, a heavy cloak she wore with quiet dignity. When she took the stand, her testimony was clear, concise, and devastating. She recounted the events leading up to Nathaniel's murder, her voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in its conviction. She described Edward's confession, Clarissa's attempted assassination, and the discovery of the incriminating documents. The defense attorneys, seasoned and ruthless, attempted to discredit her, to paint her as a jealous, scorned wife, a woman motivated by revenge. They probed into her relationship with Nathaniel, insinuating impropriety, seeking to tarnish her reputation and undermine her credibility. But Lillian held her ground. She answered their questions truthfully, unflinchingly, her gaze steady, her voice firm. She refused to be intimidated, refused to be silenced. She had come too far, endured too much, to be deterred by their legal maneuvering and personal attacks. Senator Hawthorne, acting as a character witness for Lillian and Nathaniel, delivered a powerful testimony, praising their courage, their integrity, their unwavering commitment to justice. He spoke of Nathaniel's distinguished military service, his dedication to his country, and his relentless pursuit of truth. Inspector Davies presented the forensic evidence, the ballistics reports, and the damning contents of the documents recovered from the observatory. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, painting a clear picture of a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of government. Edward, taking the stand in his own defense, attempted to portray himself as a patriot, a man who had acted out of necessity, a victim of circumstance. He claimed that he had been manipulated by Clarissa, that he had been unaware of the full extent of the conspiracy. But his testimony was weak, unconvincing, riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. He was unable to explain away the evidence, the damning documents, the testimony of multiple witnesses. He looked like a broken man, a shadow of his former self, his carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered beyond repair. Clarissa, defiant and unrepentant, took a different approach. She claimed that she had been acting alone, that Edward had been an innocent dupe, a pawn in her game. She portrayed herself as a mastermind, a woman who had single-handedly orchestrated the entire conspiracy. But her testimony was equally unconvincing. The evidence clearly showed that she and Edward had been partners in crime, working together to amass wealth and power through illegal means. As the trial neared its conclusion, Lillian found herself exhausted, emotionally drained, but strangely at peace. She had done everything she could. She had spoken the truth, honored Nathaniel's memory, and fought for justice. The outcome was now in the hands of the jury. She spent hours at Nathaniel's grave, a quiet, secluded spot in Arlington National Cemetery. She talked to him, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes for the future. She felt his presence there, a comforting, reassuring presence that gave her strength. She also began to reconnect with her son, Thomas, who had returned from the war a changed man, haunted by the horrors he had witnessed. They had been estranged for years, their relationship strained by grief, guilt, and unspoken resentments. But now, in the aftermath of the tragedy, they found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding of loss and resilience. Lillian realized that she had been so focused on her own grief, her own pain, that she had neglected her son's needs. She had been so consumed by her forbidden love for Nathaniel that she had failed to see the suffering of the man who had returned from the very war that fueled the conspiracy. She vowed to make amends, to rebuild their relationship, to be the mother he needed, the mother she had always wanted to be. It was a long and difficult process, filled with awkward silences, hesitant conversations, and painful memories. But slowly, gradually, they began to heal, to find a new connection, a new understanding. Lillian sat on the nearby bench, the sun setting now, and looked on. Chapter 17. The Reckoning of Hearts. After weeks of intense testimony, dramatic revelations, and grueling legal battles, the trial of Edward Wright, Clarissa Davenport, and their co-conspirators finally reached its conclusion. The jury, after deliberating for several days, returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom as the foreman read the verdict, the weight of justice finally settling upon the defendants. Edward, his face ashen, his shoulders slumped, showed no emotion. He had expected this, resigned to his fate. Clarissa, however, reacted with defiance, her eyes blazing with anger and resentment. She hurled insults at the jury, the judge, and Lillian, her carefully constructed facade of composure crumbling before the weight of her conviction. She was quickly subdued by court officers and led away, her screams echoing through the halls of justice. The other co-conspirators, a collection of powerful politicians, military officials, and businessmen, reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and resignation. Their carefully constructed world of privilege and impunity had come crashing down around them, their crimes exposed, their reputations shattered. Lillian, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a profound sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Nathaniel back. It couldn't erase the pain, the loss, the betrayal. Senator Hawthorne, sitting beside her, placed a comforting hand on her arm. "It's over, Lillian," he said, his voice gentle. "You did it. You brought them to justice." Lillian nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not enough," she whispered. "It's never enough." Hawthorne understood. He knew that no amount of legal retribution could fully heal the wounds of the heart, could fully compensate for the loss of a loved one. In the days following the verdict, Lillian found herself adrift, uncertain of her future. Her life had been irrevocably changed by the events of the past few months. She had lost her husband, her social standing, her sense of security. But she had also gained something, a newfound strength, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She decided to sell the Georgetown townhouse, the scene of so much pain and betrayal. She couldn't bear to live there any longer, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. She moved into a smaller, more modest home, a place where she could start anew, rebuild her life, find some semblance of peace. She continued to visit Nathaniel's grave, finding solace in his memory, in the love they had shared. She talked to him, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes for the future. She felt his presence there, a comforting, reassuring presence that gave her strength. She also deepened her connection with her son, Thomas, their relationship growing stronger with each passing day. They spent hours together, talking, sharing stories, healing the wounds of the past. Lillian realized that she had a second chance, an opportunity to build a new life, a new family, based on love, trust, and understanding. One afternoon, as she was sorting through Nathaniel's belongings, she came across a small, wooden box, tucked away in a drawer. She opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, nestled among layers of soft cloth, was a single, gold ring. A simple, elegant band, engraved with their initials, intertwined, the N and the L, the same initials they had etched into the glass of the observatory dome years ago. Lillian gasped, tears streaming down her face. It was the ring Nathaniel had planned to give her, the symbol of their love, their commitment, their dream of a future together, a future that had been stolen from them. She slipped the ring onto her finger, its cold metal a comforting weight against her skin. It was a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her. It was a tangible reminder of Nathaniel's love, a love that would endure, even in death. As she stood there, wearing Nathaniel's ring, Lillian knew that she was not alone. She had his memory, his love, to guide her. She had her son, her newfound strength, to sustain her. She had a future, uncertain but filled with possibilities. She stepped out of the house and looked around. She smiled. Chapter 18. A Love Forged in Fire. The months following the trial were a period of transition and healing for Lillian. She settled into her new home, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of Washington, far from the opulent mansions and treacherous social circles of Georgetown. The quiet simplicity of her new life was a balm to her wounded soul, a refuge from the storm that had raged through her world. She spent her days tending to her small garden, reading, writing, and reconnecting with old friends who had remained loyal throughout the ordeal. She found solace in nature, in the simple rhythms of life, in the quiet companionship of those who understood her journey. Her relationship with Thomas continued to blossom, their bond strengthened by shared grief and a newfound appreciation for each other. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and making plans for the future. Lillian realized that she had been given a second chance at motherhood, an opportunity to build a relationship with her son based on honesty, love, and mutual respect. Thomas, inspired by his mother's courage and resilience, decided to dedicate his life to public service. He enrolled in law school, determined to fight for justice, to uphold the ideals that Nathaniel had died for. Lillian supported him wholeheartedly, proud of his determination, his commitment to making a difference in the world. Senator Hawthorne remained a steadfast friend and ally, visiting Lillian regularly, offering his support and guidance. He had become a surrogate father figure to her, a source of wisdom and strength in a world that had been turned upside down. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Lillian was working in her garden, she received an unexpected visitor. A tall, distinguished-looking man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, approached her, his face etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Mrs. Wright?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Lillian looked up, surprised. She didn't recognize him. "Yes," she said, "I am Lillian Wright." The man extended his hand. "My name is Arthur Blackwood," he said. "I'm Nathaniel's brother." Lillian's heart leaped with a mixture of shock and anticipation. She had never met Nathaniel's brother, had only heard him mentioned in passing. She knew that Nathaniel had been estranged from his family for many years, a rift caused by a long-standing feud over a disputed inheritance. She took Arthur's hand, her own trembling slightly. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. Arthur's gaze softened. "Please," he said, "call me Arthur." They sat together on a small bench in the garden, surrounded by the vibrant colors of autumn leaves. Arthur explained that he had been following the trial, that he had been deeply moved by Lillian's testimony, by her courage and unwavering loyalty to Nathaniel. I never understood my brother," Arthur admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I always thought he was reckless, irresponsible. I never appreciated his dedication, his commitment to justice." He paused, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "I was wrong," he said. "I was blinded by my own pride, my own ambition. I let a foolish feud come between us." Lillian nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had witnessed firsthand the destructive power of family feuds, the bitterness and resentment that could fester for years. "Nathaniel spoke of you often," Lillian said, her voice gentle. He regretted the estrangement. He always hoped that one day you would reconcile." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I had known," he said. "I wish I had reached out to him sooner. I wasted so many years, so many opportunities." Lillian placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's not too late," she said. "You can still honor his memory. You can still make amends." Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound hope. "How?" he asked. "By carrying on his work," Lillian said. "By fighting for justice, by upholding the ideals he believed in. By being the brother he always wanted you to be." Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said. "I promise you I will." They talked for hours, sharing stories about Nathaniel, reminiscing about his life, his courage, his unwavering commitment to truth. Lillian found herself opening up to Arthur, sharing her feelings, her grief, her love for his brother. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Arthur stood to leave. "Thank you, Lillian," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your memories, your love for Nathaniel. Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." Lillian smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, "for coming, for listening, for understanding." As Arthur walked away, Lillian felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She had found a new connection, a new family, in the most unexpected of places. She had forged a bond with Nathaniel's brother, a bond built on shared grief, mutual respect, and a commitment to honoring his legacy. She watched as a single candle, lit in her window, flickered in the gathering dusk. Chapter 19. The Edge of Dawn. The passing years brought a gradual softening of the sharp edges of grief, a gentle easing of the constant ache in Lillian's heart. The memories of Nathaniel remained vivid, a cherished tapestry woven with threads of love, loss, and enduring admiration. But the raw, searing pain had subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance, a peaceful resignation to the realities of life and loss. Lillian continued to live in her cozy cottage, surrounded by her garden, her books, and the growing bond with her son, Thomas. He had graduated from law school with honors, his dedication to justice fueled by his mother's courage and Nathaniel's sacrifice. He had become a rising star in the legal world, a champion of the underdog, a voice for the voiceless. Arthur Blackwood, true to his word, had become a frequent visitor, their initial awkwardness replaced by a genuine affection and mutual respect. He had embraced his brother's legacy, dedicating his time and resources to supporting causes that Nathaniel had championed. He had become a surrogate uncle to Thomas, a mentor and friend. Lillian found herself drawn to Arthur, not in a romantic way, but in a way that acknowledged a shared history, a shared grief, and a shared commitment to honoring Nathaniel's memory. They found comfort in each other's company, a quiet understanding that transcended words. One spring morning, as Lillian was working in her garden, Thomas approached her, his face beaming with excitement. "Mother," he said, "I have some news." Lillian looked up, her heart filled with anticipation. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked.
"I've been offered a position," he said.
"A very important position." He paused, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I've been asked to run for Congress," he said. "To represent our district in Washington." Lillian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was a dream come true, a validation of everything she and Nathaniel had fought for. "Oh, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." Thomas grinned, his face radiant with happiness. "It's all thanks to you, Mother," he said. "You inspired me. You showed me the importance of fighting for what's right, of standing up for justice, no matter the cost." Lillian embraced him, tears streaming down her face. This was a moment of profound joy, a testament to the enduring power of love, hope, and resilience. As Thomas embarked on his political career, Lillian found herself drawn back into the world she had once shunned, the world of Washington society and political intrigue. But this time, she entered it on her own terms, as a respected figure, a symbol of courage and integrity. She used her influence to support Thomas's campaign, to advocate for the causes she believed in, to promote justice and equality. She became a mentor to young activists, a voice for the marginalized, a champion of those who had been wronged. She found a new sense of purpose, a new reason to live, a new way to honor Nathaniel's memory. She was no longer just a grieving widow, a victim of betrayal. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had emerged from the ashes of tragedy, stronger and more determined than ever. One evening, as Lillian and Arthur were sitting together on the porch of her cottage, watching the sunset, Arthur turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet admiration. "You've done so much, Lillian," he said. "You've overcome so much. You've built a new life, a new legacy." Lillian smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "It hasn't been easy, Arthur," she said. "But I've had help. I've had the support of my son, of my friends, of Nathaniel's memory." Arthur nodded, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "He would be proud of you, Lillian," he said. "He would be proud of the woman you've become." Lillian's heart swelled with emotion. She knew Arthur was right. Nathaniel would be proud. He would be proud of her courage, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to justice. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lillian felt a sense of peace, a sense of completion. She had come full circle, from the depths of despair to the heights of hope. She had faced unimaginable challenges, overcome insurmountable obstacles, and emerged victorious. She had lived a life filled with love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. She had found a way to honor Nathaniel's memory, to carry on his legacy, to build a better future for herself, her son, and her country. The day had been long, but the edge of dawn was in sight. Chapter 20. The candle's final flicker. The years that followed were marked by a quiet contentment, a gentle rhythm of life that soothed Lillian's soul. Thomas's political career flourished, his dedication to justice and his unwavering integrity earning him the respect and admiration of his constituents. He married a bright, compassionate woman, and they soon blessed Lillian with grandchildren, filling her life with a joy she had never thought possible. Arthur Blackwood remained a constant presence, a cherished friend and confidant. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared grief and mutual respect, had deepened over time, becoming a source of strength and comfort for both of them. They often spent evenings together, sharing stories, reminiscing about Nathaniel, and finding solace in each other's company. Lillian, though aging gracefully, found her physical strength waning. The years of stress and emotional turmoil had taken their toll, leaving her frail, but her spirit remained undimmed. She continued to be active in her community, supporting causes she believed in, mentoring young people, and sharing her wisdom and experience. One crisp autumn evening, as Lillian sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, surrounded by her family, she felt a profound sense of peace, a sense of completion. She had lived a full life, a life filled with love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. She had faced unimaginable challenges, overcome insurmountable obstacles, and emerged victorious. She looked around at her family, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Thomas, now a respected senator, sat beside her, holding her hand. His wife, Sarah, sat across from them, cradling their youngest child in her arms. Arthur Blackwood sat nearby, his eyes filled with a quiet affection. "I'm so proud of you, Thomas," Lillian said, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "You've become the man Nathaniel always knew you could be." Thomas smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Mother," he said. "It's all thanks to you. You taught me the importance of fighting for what's right, of standing up for justice, no matter the cost." Lillian turned to Arthur, her gaze filled with affection. "And thank you, Arthur," she said, "for being such a good friend, such a loyal companion, for honoring Nathaniel's memory in such a meaningful way." Arthur nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "It's been my privilege, Lillian," he said. "Nathaniel was a great man. I'm proud to call him my brother." As the evening wore on, Lillian felt her strength ebbing away. She knew that her time was near, that the final chapter of her life was drawing to a close. She looked at her family, her heart filled with love and gratitude. "I'm ready," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm ready to go." She closed her eyes, a peaceful smile gracing her lips. She felt a gentle warmth surrounding her, a sense of love and acceptance. She imagined Nathaniel waiting for her, his hand outstretched, his eyes filled with the same love and admiration she had always seen in them. As her breathing slowed and her heart beat its final rhythm, a single candle on the mantelpiece, the same candle she had lit for Nathaniel so many years ago, flickered and went out. The room was filled with a profound silence, a sense of loss and grief, but also a sense of peace and completion. Lillian Wright, a woman of courage, resilience, and unwavering love, had passed from this world, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Her story, a story of forbidden love, wartime betrayal, and ultimate redemption, would be told and retold, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still flourish, love can still conquer, and justice can still prevail. As the last light faded, one thing remained: her memory. Epilogue. Years later, on a crisp autumn day, Thomas Blackwood, now a seasoned senator with streaks of silver in his hair, stood before his mother's grave. Beside him stood his own son, Nathaniel, named for the man who had so profoundly shaped their family's destiny, though he had never met him. The leaves swirled around them, a gentle reminder of the passage of time, of the cyclical nature of life and loss. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, Nathaniel, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. She faced unimaginable challenges, but she never lost her courage, her compassion, or her commitment to justice. Young Nathaniel, a bright, inquisitive boy, looked up at his father. "Tell me about her, Dad," he said. "Tell me about the Major." Thomas smiled, a wistful smile that reflected both the pain of the past and the hope for the future. He knelt down beside his son, placing a hand on the smooth, cold stone of the headstone. "It's a long story, son," he said. "A story of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. A story of a world torn apart by war and a love that bloomed in the shadows." He began to recount the tale of Lillian Wright and Major Nathaniel Blackwood, of their forbidden romance, of the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy them, and of Lillian's unwavering determination to expose the truth and bring the perpetrators to justice. He spoke of Edward Wright, the powerful senator who had betrayed his country and his wife, and of Clarissa Davenport, the woman who had manipulated and schemed her way into the heart of the conspiracy. He spoke of Senator Hawthorne, the steadfast ally who had stood by Lillian and Nathaniel, and of Inspector Davies, the dedicated officer who had helped unravel the complex web of deceit. He spoke of Arthur Blackwood, the estranged brother who had finally found redemption, honoring Nathaniel's memory by dedicating his life to service. As he spoke, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the cemetery, illuminating the names and dates etched into the stones, the silent witnesses to generations of lives lived and lost. Young Nathaniel listened intently, his eyes wide with wonder and a growing understanding of the legacy he had inherited, the legacy of courage, integrity, and unwavering love. "Grandma Lillian was a hero, wasn't she, Dad?" he said, his voice filled with awe. Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, son," he said.
"She was."
And so was Major Blackwood. They were both heroes in their own way. He stood up, taking his son's hand. "Come on, Nathaniel," he said. "It's time to go home." As they walked away from the grave, the wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of a love story that had defied time, distance, and even death. The story of Lillian Wright and Major Nathaniel Blackwood would live on, passed down through generations, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still flourish, love can still conquer, and justice can still prevail. The candle might have flickered and gone out, but its light, the light of their love and courage, would continue to shine, a beacon of hope for generations to come.